So the American tomato industry is collapsing. And the reason isn't a drought or a plague or a supply chain crisis caused by some force of nature nobody could have predicted. The reason is 38 million Canadians decided to stop buying American food. 12 billion in agricultural trade that used to flow from Canada to the United States is now flowing from Canada to Mexico. Tomato farms in Florida are shuttering operations. Packing houses are laying off thousands. Trucking companies that move produce to the Canadian border are sitting idle with empty refrigerated trailers. And Donald Trump, the president whose tariffs caused the boycott that caused the collapse, is in full panic mode because the people being destroyed are his own voters in his own swing states. When you follow the tomato from a farm in Immaquahee, Florida, to a grocery shelf in Toronto and see exactly where the chain broke, you'll understand why this crisis can't be fixed with a tweet or a tariff or a bailout. And Warren Buffett's response from the man who has owned Heinz Ketchup for over a decade, whose company sources American tomatoes by the millions of tons, cuts to the bone of what happens when a president starts a trade war with a country that buys his nation's food. Subscribe now because this is spreading beyond tomatoes. And when you hear which agricultural sectors are next, you'll want to be following this story. The boycott didn't start with a government order. There was no legislation, no executive action, no official Canadian policy declaring that Canadians should stop buying American produce. It started with anger when Trump called Canada the 51st state, when he posted maps on social media that erased Canada from the continent, when he questioned Canadian sovereignty as a matter of public policy, when he imposed tariffs on everything from lumber to steel to dairy to aluminum. Canadians got angry. And angry Canadians did what consumers everywhere do. When they get angry enough, they stop buying. The polling tells the story in numbers. By March 2025, 62% of Canadians reported actively avoiding American products when shopping. Not occasionally, not when reminded, but as a deliberate, consistent purchasing habit. By January 2026, 91% of Canadians said Canada should reduce its economic dependence on the United States. Those aren't political polls. Those are consumer behavior surveys. And consumer behavior is the most powerful economic force on earth because it doesn't require coordination, doesn't require leadership, doesn't require legislation. It just requires 38 million people making the same choice at the same grocery shelf. Canadian grocery chains responded to the shift with the speed of companies that understand which direction their customers are moving. Loblaws, Soys, and Metro, the three chains that control the majority of Canadian grocery retail, all launched prominent campaigns highlighting Canadian-produced and non-American alternatives. Shelf placement changed overnight. American products were moved from eye-level prime position to lower or higher shelves, while Canadian and Mexican alternatives took the premium spots. Signage changed. Bright Canadian grown and product of Mexico labels appeared next to produced displays that previously showed no origin labeling at all. Country of origin information became the most prominent feature on produce signage, sometimes larger than the price, because the chains understood that their customers were making purchasing decisions based on national origin before they looked at the cost. Apps emerged that let Canadian shoppers scan barcodes and instantly identify American origin products so they could choose alternatives. One app called Maple Scan was downloaded over 2 million times in its first month. Social media amplified and sustained the movement in ways that no traditional boycott could have achieved. Campaigns under the hashtags Boycott America and Buy Canadian trended continuously for months on every major platform. Influencers posted grocery haul videos showing how to shop an entire week without buying a single American product. Recipe bloggers replaced American ingredients with Canadian and Mexican alternatives and published the substitution guides. Chemex's premier specifically urged consumers to swap California tomatoes for Italian, Ohio pepperoni for Quebec-produced, Idaho potatoes for Prince Edward Island potatoes, California wine for Niagara or Okanagan Valley wines. Local newspapers published weekly guides to American product alternatives. Community Facebook groups organized around the mission of helping neighbors identify and avoid American origin goods. This wasn't a fringe movement confined to activist circles. This was a national economic reflex, a self-organizing consumer revolution with no central leadership and no off switch, Millions of individual purchasing decisions made independently without coordination that collectively became one of the most devastating consumer boycotts in modern trade history. Fresh produce became ground zero for the boycott for reasons that have everything to do with how grocery shopping works. Tomatoes are visible, unlike steel embedded in a car frame or lumber hidden inside a wall. Tomatoes sit on a grocery shelf with a country of origin sticker that says product of USA. The Canadian consumer can see that sticker, look at the tomato next to it labeled product of Mexico, and make a choice in 2 seconds. Tomatoes are substitutable. Mexican tomatoes, Canadian greenhouse tomatoes, and European imports are readily available and often price competitive, and tomatoes are perishable. Unlike manufactured goods that can be warehoused and redirected over weeks or months, tomatoes rot. When demand drops, the product doesn't wait. It dies in the field, in the truck, in the packing house. You cannot stockpile your way through a tomato boycott. The speed of the shift was staggering. Within 3 months of the most aggressive tariff rounds, American fresh produce exports to Canada dropped by 40%. Tomato exports specifically dropped by over 55%. More than half the market simply vanished. And every dollar that stopped crossing the northern border started crossing the southern one from Mexico. But the boycott is only the demand side of the story. What happened on the supply side on American farms is where the real devastation begins. Follow the tomato. Start in Immokalee, Florida, a small town in Kern County, about 35 miles east of Naples that most Americans have never heard of. Imachi is the tomato capital of the United States. The surrounding region produces roughly half of America's fresh market tomatoes. The Florida tomato industry is a $1.5 billion operation employing tens of thousands of seasonal workers, pickers, packers, sorters, truck drivers, mechanics, field supervisors, a sprawling agricultural economy built over decades around one simple fact. Americans and Canadians eat tomatoes year-round, and Florida can grow them when nobody else in North America can. When Canada stopped buying, Florida farms faced a sudden 15 to 20% demand drop. For a commodity that cannot be stored, that has a shelf life measured in days, that requires harvesting at precise ripeness windows, a 15 to 20% demand drop isn't a business setback. It's a catastrophe. You can't redirect tomatoes to another buyer in 48 hours. The logistics don't exist. The contracts don't exist. The cold chain isn't set up. And so the tomatoes rotted. Reports began emerging from Kern County, Henry County, and across southwest Florida, fields left unharvested. Acres of ripe tomatoes turning brown in the sun because it costs more to pick, pack, and ship them than the collapsing market price would return. Farmers who had invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in seed, fertilizer, irrigation, and labor for the current growing season watched their investment decompose in the field. The packing houses went next. These are the facilities that receive tomatoes from the field, sort them by size and quality, grade them for retail or food service, and pack them into the boxes that get loaded onto refrigerated trucks. When the volume of tomatoes coming in dropped, the packing houses didn't need as many workers. Layoffs started within weeks of the boycott's acceleration. Some facilities shifted to reduced hours. Others shut down entirely, padlocking their doors and sending workers home with no return date. The ripple effect radiated outward. Trucking companies that had run refrigerated loads from Immokalee up Interstate 75 to the Canadian border now had empty trailers and canceled contracts. Cardboard box manufacturers that supplied the packing houses saw orders drop. Refrigeration repair services, fuel stations along the produce corridor, the restaurants and motel in Immokalee that served seasonal agricultural workers. Every business connected to the tomato supply chain felt the contraction. California was hit on a different front. The state's tomato industry is massive, over $1 billion annually, but it's concentrated in processing tomatoes rather than fresh market. These are the tomatoes that become canned tomatoes, tomato paste, ketchup, marinara sauce, soup, salsa. The boycott hit processed products harder than anyone expected. Canadian grocery chains started sourcing Italian canned tomatoes instead of American. Canadian restaurants switched to Mexican or domestic suppliers for their sauces and bases. Central Valley operations that had invested millions in expansion based on projected Canadian demand were suddenly sitting on overcapacity. Processing equipment running below capacity contracts canceled or renegotiated at lower volumes. The human cost is measured in paychecks that stopped arriving. Seasonal agricultural workers, many of them migrants, travel to Florida for the winter tomato season and other states for other harvests through the year, lost work. No harvest means no paycheck. These aren't salaried employees with savings accounts and severance packages. These are workers who earn by the bucket and live season to season. Small farm operators, often family operations that have been growing tomatoes for 2 or 3 generations, couldn't absorb the revenue loss. Some defaulted on the operating loans they had taken to fund the current season's planting, seeds, fertilizer, fuel, labor advances, loans that were supposed to be repaid with the proceeds from the harvest that is now rotting in the field. Communities built around agricultural processing, Immokalee, Oxnard, Patterson in the Central Valley, experienced rapid economic contraction that rippled through every local business from the hardware store to the school system. And here's the cruelest irony. Many of these agricultural communities voted for Trump. The tariffs they supported, the trade war they cheered is destroying their livelihoods. The people chanting at the rallies are the people losing their farms. The price collapse made everything worse. With Canadian demand gone and no alternative export buyer at anywhere near the same scale, domestic tomato prices crashed. Wholesale prices dropped approximately 30% as supply overwhelmed the remaining domestic market. Even American consumers who were still buying American tomatoes were paying less, which sounds like a consumer win until you realize that below-cost prices mean farms can't cover production costs, which means they don't plant next season, which means supply eventually contracts, which means prices eventually spike. But by then, the farms are gone, the workers have scattered, and the infrastructure has deteriorated. The price collapse isn't cheap tomatoes, it's the death spiral of an industry. But while American farms were collapsing, someone else was filling the gap, and the numbers are staggering. Mexico didn't plan this. Mexico didn't strategize. Mexico didn't weaponize anything. Mexico simply continued doing what Mexico has done for decades, growing tomatoes. Mexico is already the world's largest exporter of fresh tomatoes. Mexican agricultural infrastructure, particularly in Sinaloa, Sonora, and Baja California, was built over decades to serve exactly this kind of market opportunity. Massive greenhouse operations, established cold chain logistics, existing certifications for international food safety standards, experienced labor forces. When Canada stopped buying American produce, Canadian importers didn't stop buying produce. They redirected, and the most obvious, most available, most price competitive, most logistically connected alternative was Mexico. The 12 billion number represents the total agricultural trade shift across all produce categories. And it breaks down like this. Approximately $3.2 billion in fresh tomatoes redirected as Canadian retailers and food service companies replaced American suppliers with Mexican producers, signed new contracts, and built new purchasing relationships. Approximately $4.5 billion in other fresh produce. Berries, peppers, cucumbers, avocados, citrus, as Canadian buyers applied the same boycott logic across every produce category where American origin was visible on the label. Approximately $2.8 billion in processed foods, canned tomatoes, sauces, frozen vegetables as Canadian food manufacturers and restaurant chains switched to Mexican and European inputs, and approximately $1.5 billion in ancillary economic activity. New logistics infrastructure, packaging facilities, cold chain expansion created in Mexico to serve the suddenly expanded Canadian market. Mexico was perfectly positioned to capture this windfall for structural reasons that have nothing to do with the boycott itself. Mexico already had preferential trade access to Canadian markets through the CPTP, the comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership that the United States withdrew from under Trump's first administration, a withdrawal that was celebrated as an act of economic sovereignty and is now functioning as a self-inflicted wound that gives Mexico tariff advantages America doesn't have. Mexican agricultural operations were already operating at scale with existing certifications for Canadian food safety standards, certifications that take months to obtain and that American competitors used to view as unnecessary because they already had the Canadian market locked up. The logistics corridor between Mexico and Canada via truck rail and increasingly direct maritime shipping routes through the Pacific was already operational and expanding, and Mexico's labor cost advantage meant Mexican tomatoes were often price competitive with American tomatoes. Even before the boycott removed the American product from Canadian shelves entirely, Trump's tariffs were supposed to make Mexico pay. Instead, they made Mexico rich. Every dollar in punitive tariffs that Trump imposed on Canadian goods created a dollar in boycott-driven market opportunity that Mexico captured without lifting a strategic finger. The trade war wasn't a war between America and Canada. It was an involuntary wealth transfer from American farms to Mexican farms, mediated by 38 million angry Canadian grocery shoppers who didn't need anyone's permission to redirect their purchasing power. The multiplier effect in Mexico is accelerating. New greenhouse construction in Sinaloa is being fast-tracked to meet Canadian demand. State-of-the-art climate-controlled facilities that will produce tomatoes year-round for decades. Cold chain logistics infrastructure along the Pacific corridor is expanding with new refrigerated warehousing and transport capacity. New packaging facilities designed specifically for the Canadian retail market with bilingual labeling, Canadian food certification markings, and packaging sizes calibrated to Canadian consumer preferences are being built and staffed. Employment is growing in Mexican agricultural communities, Culiacan, Los Mocas, Hermosillo, and Sonata at the same rate as contracting in their American counterparts. The same jobs disappearing in Immokalee, Florida, are appearing in Culiacan, Sinaloa. The same investment fleeing southwest Florida is arriving in northwest Mexico. Mexico didn't weaponize anything. Mexico didn't lobby or threaten or impose retaliatory tariffs or make speeches. Mexico just existed as the alternative, and that was enough. When the scale of this disaster finally became undeniable, when the agricultural industry reports quantified the damage in numbers that couldn't be dismissed, when Florida farm organizations began issuing emergency warnings and requesting federal assistance, when the media picked up the images of tomatoes rotting in fields and packing house workers standing in unemployment lines, Trump's response cycled through his usual stages with visible, unmistakable panic underneath each one. First, denial. On Truth Social, the tomato industry is doing great, best numbers ever. Fake news is trying to create a crisis that doesn't exist. American farmers are the best in the world, and they're winning. The Post went up on the same day the USDA released data showing a 55% decline in tomato exports to Canada. The numbers were from his own government's Agricultural Statistics Service. Denial lasted approximately 72 hours before the evidence became overwhelming. Then blame. He called Canadian consumers ungrateful, as though purchasing decisions made by sovereign citizens in a foreign country constituted ingratitude toward a trading partner that had spent months insulting their sovereignty. He accused Carney of weaponizing grocery stores against American farmers. Ignoring the fact that no government policy had been issued, no boycott had been legislated, and the Canadian government had done nothing except watch its own citizens make independent economic choices. He blamed American media for talking down the tomato industry, a classic deflection that treated reporting the collapse as causing the collapse, then threats. He floated the idea of imposing tariffs on Mexican tomato imports to prevent Mexico from capturing the Canadian market, a move so economically illiterate that his own trade advisors reportedly opposed it unanimously. Tariffing Mexican tomatoes wouldn't restore Canadian demand for American produce. It would raise tomato prices for American consumers, the families buying tomatoes for their salads, their sandwiches, their children's lunches, while doing absolutely nothing to persuade a single Canadian shopper to change their behavior at the grocery store. The tariff would punish Americans for a boycott conducted by Canadians. The absurdity was total. And finally, the trial balloon that revealed the true depth of the panic. Reports emerged that the administration was exploring an emergency agricultural subsidy for affected tomato growers, essentially using taxpayer money to compensate farmers for damage caused by the president's own trade policy. Think about that for a moment. Really think about it. The government imposing tariffs on Canadian goods, the tariffs triggering a consumer boycott, the boycott collapsing the tomato industry, and then the government paying farmers with taxpayer money because the tariffs destroyed their markets. The taxpayer pays for the tariff in higher prices, and then the taxpayer pays again to subsidize the farmers the tariff destroyed. It's a closed loop of self-inflicted economic damage funded entirely by the American public, benefiting nobody except the Mexican producers who captured the market by doing nothing at all. Every response fails because every response misunderstands the fundamental nature of the problem. You cannot tariff your way back into a consumer boycott. Canadian consumers aren't avoiding American tomatoes because of tariff rates or trade policy specifics. They're avoiding them because they're angry, because their sovereignty was insulted, because their country was called the 51st state by the president of the country that was supposed to be their closest friend. No tariff adjustment fixes that. No executive order reverses it. The damage isn't economic, it's psychological, and psychology doesn't negotiate. Tariffing Mexican tomatoes would raise food prices for American families, punishing the people Trump claims to be protecting. A bailout would be an implicit admission that the tariffs are causing harm, politically devastating for a president who publicly insists tariffs are a beautiful thing, and none of it addresses the structural reality. Mexico has already captured the market. Canadian importers have signed multi-year contracts with Mexican producers. New supply chain infrastructure is being built. You cannot unredirect a supply chain by posting on Truth Social at midnight. The political dimension makes the panic even more acute. Florida is a critical state. The tomato communities in Southwest Florida are in congressional districts that any Republican needs. Agricultural workers, farm owners, packing house operators, these aren't abstract economic statistics. These are voters who showed up for Trump, who cheered the tariffs, who believed the trade war would make them stronger. They are watching their livelihoods collapse while Mexican competitors capture their markets. And no amount of rally rhetoric can compensate for a field of rotting tomatoes that used to be a paycheck. And this isn't just tomatoes. The tomato is the canary in the coal mine for a much broader agricultural disaster that is unfolding across every produce category, every food processing sector, and every agricultural export corridor that connects the United States to its largest trading partner. The same dynamic playing out in tomatoes is replicating across American agriculture with the mechanical precision of an economic law. U.S. agricultural exports overall have suffered approximately $57 billion in projected value loss since the trade war began, a number so large that it exceeds the GDP of most countries. Canadian travel to the United States is down 40%, devastating northern border tourism economies from Maine to Washington state. Canadian consumers are swapping American brands for alternatives across every grocery category, from fresh produce to processed foods to beverages to snacks to condiments to frozen meals. The Buy Canadian movement has expanded far beyond food into clothing, electronics, entertainment, travel, and even digital subscriptions, American brands that Canadians grew up with and took for granted. Brands that were part of the cultural furniture of Canadian life for decades are being replaced by alternatives that Canadian consumers are discovering they prefer, or at least prefer enough when the alternative is sending money to a country that insults them. And the structural shifts are hardening into permanence with each passing week. Mexican producers are signing multi-year contracts with Canadian buyers, 3-year, 5-year, sometimes 1-0-year supply agreements backed by infrastructure investments, staffing commitments, and quality guarantees. These aren't temporary substitutions that evaporate when the political mood shifts. They're new permanent commercial relationships with contractual penalties for early termination. Canadian greenhouse operations are expanding at unprecedented rates to replace American produce with domestic production that can supply year-round. A $2 billion expansion in Canadian greenhouse capacity is underway that, once built, will permanently reduce Canada's need for American winter produce. The EU is filling gaps that Mexico can't. Italian canned tomatoes replacing American and Canadian pasta sauce. Spanish citrus replacing Californian and Canadian juice. French and Irish dairy replacing Wisconsin and Canadian cheese. These supply chain redirections, once established with contracts and infrastructure and trained workforces, don't reverse when tariffs are lifted. When a Mexican greenhouse operation signs a 5-year supply contract with low laws guaranteeing specific volumes at specific prices with specific quality standards, that contract doesn't evaporate because Trump posts on Truth Social or lifts a tariff by executive order. The contract endures, the infrastructure endures, the relationship endures. American agriculture was supposed to be untouchable, the breadbasket of the world, the one sector that was immune to trade wars because everyone needs food and America grows more of it than anyone. It turns out that when your best customer gets angry enough, they can replace you. Not perfectly, not immediately, but enough to collapse your margins, shutter your farms, bankrupt your operators, and redirect billions to your competitors. Enough to permanently restructure the supply chains that your industry depends on. Enough to prove that no industry is too essential to be destroyed by bad policy. And the man who owns more American food brands than almost anyone on earth was watching all of this unfold from Omaha with the particular clarity of someone whose money is directly on the line. Warren Buffett addressed the tomato crisis with his usual calm tone, but his message carried serious implications. Through Berkshire Hathaway, Buffett is directly connected to the industry-owning companies like Kraft Heinz, maker of Heinz Ketchup, which depends heavily on American tomatoes. Berkshire also owns Dairy Queen and BNSF Railway, both tied to agricultural supply chains. Buffett warned that the real damage isn't just financial, but reputational. American agriculture spent decades building global trust, but policy instability and trade tensions are now pushing international buyers, especially in Canada, to sign long-term supply deals with Mexico instead. According to Buffett, this is not a temporary disruption, but a permanent restructuring of supply chains. As Canadian consumers shift away from U.S. products, American farms face collapsing prices, lost export markets, and even bankruptcy. Meanwhile, Mexico is expanding greenhouse production and infrastructure to capture the market long term. Buffett emphasized that once trust and supply relationships are lost, rebuilding them can take an entire generation, showing how a simple consumer decision at the grocery store can reshape an entire industry.